Neelanjan, it's good to see you. Old friends, we go way back, and I usually have a sense of what you're up to, but you've taken on a new initiative that I don't know a lot about. You are the first director of the Center for Rapid Insights at Artha. Tell us a little bit about CRI and what you're doing.
So, the logic of CRI, the Center for Rapid Insights, was actually a single question, which is there's a piece of information that society might want to know, that a policymaker might want to know, and we need that information right away, right? So, we just had a heat wave in India. So, maybe we want to understand what the health impact of that heat wave was. Um, there's a particular policy the government wants to understand whether people are satisfied or not satisfied with it. They need to know in real time who's satisfied, who is not, what the problems might be, so that they can adjust and calibrate their own policies, right? These are not the kinds of questions that typical academic type surveying or even your standard brick and mortar polling can actually address. Those take weeks, if not months, to run. The machinery that we have can reach tens of thousands of people within a day. And so even with any kind of post-processing, we're talking about from conceiving of a question to delivering results, no more than 48 hours.
So tell us a little bit about the machinery that you guys have come up with and how does it work? Because I think the key term in Center for Rapid Insights is the rapid part, right? So what is the innovation here in terms of method of reaching people?
So the machinery that we have, which has often been used in marketing, has been used in other kinds of polling, is to be able to ask questions quickly, to reach large numbers of people across the country, and to ask a short survey over the phone over IVR. Right? The step that we have added, right? So if I talk to a policymaker, if I talk to some person in society who's interested in getting a very good estimate on a particular social issue, is that we don't know who's picking up the phone. We don't know how often you're having to call in a particular area. Now, all of these issues require some kind of statistical adjustment. So when I came on, the big question was we have this amazing machine. We know we can rapidly get information, but can we process that information in a way, in a rigorous way, to make it believable to policymakers? And so what we've done since we've gotten to understand this machine is we take the data, we run a fairly sophisticated statistical model that allows us to understand how people with certain demographic characteristics, how well off you are, your age, your gender, your caste, are responding to this particular question. And then we're able to look at national estimates of each of these populations. And based on sort of cross-tabulating these pieces of information, we're able to give you a representative estimate of the population.
So, you and I have done surveys together, and most of our surveys have been done the old-fashioned way, right? Which is you hire a survey organization, they have an army of enumerators, they go house to house,
That's right.
right? Randomly selecting houses and so on and so forth. They're done on paper or they're done on tablets or smartphones. This is done by telephone, right? And this is kind of something that's been done in a lot of other countries, but I think is kind of relatively new in India. Not a lot of people doing it. What is the advantage to this form of doing surveys?
So I'll say two things. So first, my own belief is that this is where the world is going anyway. So if you look at more developed countries, people don't answer the door anymore.
Right.
People aren't willing to go door to door. As incomes rise, as people lead more busy lives in India, as they are everywhere else around the world, your simple capacity to run a brick and mortar paper survey or a tablet survey is going to go down, right? Especially in middle class and upper middle class areas. So what has happened in the West actually is you are almost always using some version of a phone survey or an online panel in combination with statistical adjustment to be able to get good estimates, right? And so what we're doing, and I think we're the first ones to really be doing in India, is to use a lot of those techniques that have been developed overseas and apply them to the Indian context. Because in a real sense, this is going to be where the world is going 5, 7, 10 years from now in India. The second thing that I would say is that there are real benefits to being able to reach huge numbers of people in a very short period of time. So Let's take, for example, a harder to reach population. I want to reach households that have sent a migrant to somewhere else in the country. Now, in a brick and mortar survey, you basically have to go and survey everybody and just find the subset of people who have migrants out of the household. Here, because you're sort of asking, you're dialing numbers sort of in a rapid fire manner, you can simply ask people, only answer this question if you are a migrant or if your household has a migrant in the family. And then you very quickly get exactly the sample that you want. So not only does it help you in sort of speed in a more general sense, but it actually solves a very standard problem that we have in brick and mortar surveys.
So, Neelan, we're doing this a conversation at a time when I think there's a lot of skepticism about polling in India, given what we've seen with the 2024 elections and the fact that almost no one none of the big pollsters anyway got it right. But it's not just an India story. I mean, you and I follow U.S. politics very closely. This has been a thorn in the side of the U.S. political industry now for years about polling error and people not being able to forecast elections. Now, I know we're not talking about elections per se, but there is a lot of skepticism in India and worldwide. What are some of the things that you do through CRI that help to give us confidence or to overcome some of that skepticism about the nature of polling? Right? I mean, it's an imperfect science,
Right.
but obviously there's things you can do to try to reduce the amount of error.
So, so I would say two things. So first, I think the scale of polling error that we're having in India is significantly greater than what we see in the US. And there's something very interesting in that, right? So if we look at election polling in the US, let's say like Nate Silver, 538, they're essentially using these methods. They're using phone surveys, online surveys, running a statistical model, and then trying to come up with an estimate. Now, there is polling error, but the polling error at a national level is typically no more than 1 or 2 percentage points. In India, everybody running brick and mortar surveys, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, is still missing by 10 percentage points, 5 percentage points, big numbers. So it tells you that a priori, there is a way in which you can take biased phone data or biased online data, build the appropriate statistical model, and get pretty close to the right answer. Now, as you say, I think there are concerns when it comes to particular issues about how credible any polling is, right? There are people you can't reach. There are people who will lie to you, people who don't want to admit certain pieces of information. Some of that goes into designing the survey, what kind of questions you can ask, can't ask. But the other thing that goes into much of the work that we do here is that there are validation steps, right? So if I look at a data point that I'm getting, I'll then compare it to an existing national survey, or I'll look for another agency that has estimated similar
Right.
things, right? Do these numbers make sense, right? So far, we've been lucky. I think most of the time we've gotten numbers that make sense. You can't guarantee that's always going to happen in any survey, but it has happened so far.
So, I'm obsessing over the methodology because I think it's both the innovation and I think it's crucial to understanding how this whole thing works. But I think I don't want to dwell on it too much because I think the use cases are really kind of the the meat and potatoes of what you're doing. So you mentioned earlier this question of the heat wave that occurred across North India. Tell us a little bit about the question you had or the puzzle, what the survey did and kind of what you found, right?
So I'll bring in a little more information into this. So we have recently run a series of surveys on the impact of heat, the extent to which people are able to mitigate the negative effects of heat in India. Now, the problem came about because in May, India went through a particularly brutal heat wave. So, in short order, we had to come up with a series of questions that sort of captured key pieces of policy information or social information about how the heat wave was affecting people. So again, in standard brick and mortar survey, even if we came up with the questions, you wouldn't be able to field the survey in time to be able to answer questions about the heat wave. We were able to put the questions together over about a 1.5 week period. We ran 3 rounds of surveys, one on the extent to which there were heat-induced illnesses in the household, one on the extent to which people could adequately cool the insides of their homes so that they were comfortable during the heat wave, and one on whether their workplace was adequately cooled so that they were comfortable in their workplace. Now, that's one part of it, which is capturing a piece of information that we care about, health, whether you're able to mitigate in a heat wave, on a particular topical event that's happening in real time, right? That's where CRI helps us. The other part of this, though, is trying to be very serious about what it means to be exposed to heat. And so, what we actually did is that the sampling itself may have been nationwide, but we used satellite data and gridded satellite data, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer data, to be able to figure out exactly how hot it was over that period all across the country.
Which is something you can establish independent of the survey because you have other sources of data.
Exactly. And so once we knew that, once we knew where it has been hot, and we know where our respondents are, and we have this key piece of information, which is how uncomfortable were you due to the heat, how ill did you get due to the heat, we're able to correlate the two pieces of information. And so I think we are the only institution that was able to come up with an estimate on the health impacts of the recent heat wave. Because you take the satellite data on the heat wave, you correlate it to this rapid information on who got ill due to the heat, how comfortable were people during this heat wave all across the country. And then you're able to estimate exactly how much more illness you're seeing in the population, how much more uncomfortable people are as a function of the heat that they experienced. And there are other things you can do with satellite data as well. You can actually look at places that have more dense growth, more green cover, and we do in fact find that especially among the poor, those who live in more densely built areas are indeed being exposed to much more heat and are not able to adequately cool their insides of their homes.
So, I mean, obviously there is an academic interest in this stuff, right? And you can use it to publish papers and all sorts of stuff. But I think there's a deeper motivation, which is to make this a tool that is connected to policy, right? Because at the end of the day, this is something that has a real world, real time practical application. So tell us a little bit about if there are any other use cases you could think of where, this was kind of integrated with some policymaking apparatus to deliver something of value with a quick turnaround.
So one of the things that we've been doing, I can't talk exactly about it because it's a government partnership, is that certain states have been rolling out a certain kind of scheme, a certain kind of benefit scheme. And there are two kinds of benefit schemes that you typically see in the population. One that you might see is I am giving you some money to see if I can change your behavior.
Right.
Right. So often the government will subsidize buying of LPG cylinders, right? So that we switch from dirty
Right.
fuel
To a clean cooking
clean
gas. Yeah.
gas, right? The second kind of question might be, okay, we have this target population, we have come up with this policy, we want to understand how satisfied they are, right? So the first set of questions is asking, will this policy work? Second set of questions is saying, okay, the policy's already been rolled out. How happy are you? So we've actually done both of these kinds of studies with various governments, and the idea is very simple. If we want to know whether a policy will work, we, in this rapid way, reach the exact target population, right? And again, which is very hard with brick and mortar surveys. And we ask them, if you're given this amount of money, will you do the desired behavior? Some say yes, some say no. That piece of information is extremely important for the government to be able to calibrate how much money it should be giving for behavioral change. Okay.
So, some of this work that you're doing for governments presumably is not necessarily for public consumption. You're providing a service essentially to policymakers. And again, because Artha is interested in real world policy impact, I think that makes sense. But if you go back to the heat example, and there may be others you want to talk about, there is a more public facing engagement. I know, for instance, you've had this partnership with the Hindustan Times. Tell us a little bit about like the dissemination once you do these surveys. What happens to the results?
So, as you said, the goal of this is speed. It's rapid, right? So once we have the survey data, within a few days, we're processing it. We are combining it with existing administrative data, satellite data in the ways that I talked about. And then we're trying to create methods to disseminate that information to the public. Now, there are two key ways in which we do it. We write longer reports, which are almost a bit more academic. They are for more policy-interested audiences. We also regularly take the information and put them in, high circulation newspapers. So at the moment, we have a very strong partnership with Hindustan Times. And essentially every week to 10 days, we put out a new piece of information on an issue that matters. So if you want to think about some of the things that we've covered, talked about the heat wave, how comfortable were people in their homes during the heat wave, how much illness did households face due to heat during the heat wave? What did media usage look like during the election, between social media and traditional media? What is the character of healthcare expenditure, right? A big policy question. If I'm going to the hospital, is the government card doing what I want it to do? Am I having to pay out of pocket? Education preferences, right? So we're able to ask, okay, when you choose a school for your child in your household, what's the most important criterion? Now you might say, okay, well, some of this data already exists in, IHDS and NSS, but these are surveys that are coming out once every 5 years. Census, we'll have to see when it comes out next. The idea of getting this real-time data and the speed at which we're getting it, particularly in the post-COVID period, so much of the world has changed. And we basically need to re-estimate every single social value. So in a period like this, where we really don't have any data that we can trust, even on very, very standard issues of health policy and education policy, the ability to sort of rapidly generate a key data point is something that has sort of incredible importance, not just to the policy community, but even for the more interested member of civil society to be able to understand where we are and where some of these issues are.
So, there are certain things that this method and this setup you've developed are really good for. There's probably some things it's not really tailor-made to do because of the nature of the technology, because of the nature of the quick turnaround time. So just give us a little bit like the pros and the cons, right? Like you've talked a little bit about the advantages. Like what are some of the limitations in terms of what this type of methodology can do, right? Like how is it best trained to tackle a certain set of problems?
So I always, when we're working with a new client or we're working with the government or even trying to think about what questions to throw out there for society, I think of it this way, right? Which is, what is the highest impact piece of information that I can give you? Like an objective piece of information or a relatively objective piece of information that you want to know, that you need to know, right? What's nice about something like that is that an objective piece of information, like, is it too hot inside your house, is not controversial, right? It's not political. I mean, we can make it political, right? It's not political to the individual. And so they have no incentive to lie, to be bashful, to refuse to respond. And the reality is, if you do ask questions that have those kinds of characteristics, right, that encourage people to lie, that may make people hesitate in some way.
I mean, there's this issue of, social desirability bias is what the social scientists call it, right? That
Exactly.
people may answer a question the way they think you want them to answer.
So here you actually, I mean, maybe it's a good thing. In brick-and-mortar surveys, people, there's an element of coercion. There's a person standing in front of you saying, give me the right answer. Here, the person can just refuse to answer. They can hang up the phone, or as you said, they can answer in a manner that is consistent with social desirability bias. There's sort of no coercion in this process, right? That's a good thing, perhaps, from the standpoint of bothering somebody, but of course, it can generate biases in the data, right? So, information that's particularly sensitive, I would be more wary about. I think the other thing that we should be honest about with any survey, but certainly a survey that's run on IVR, like what we're doing with CRI, is that
And just say what IVR is for
Oh,
people who know.
so IVR is basically pre-recorded messages. So, when you pick up the phone, you are asked a question as a pre-recorded message, and it says, if your answer is X, press 1.
Right.
If your answer is Y, press 2, and so on and so forth. And you might think, okay, this is this kind of annoying call. How can it? But that's where the statistics comes in. I would agree that if you just took that data as is, that would be perhaps not the most effective way of informing policy. But it turns out that over the years, we have figured out how to use IVR data and then get good estimates. So, um, so this is, of course, limiting in certain ways. The other thing is people aren't going to hold on to the phone for a very long time.
Right.
So you should only ask 2, 3, 4 questions. But once you say, as I say, if you have a data point that you need, if you know you can get it quickly, people typically don't have an incentive to lie to you about that information. That's where this machinery is particularly effective.
Let me just ask you, because it came up earlier, but we didn't really dwell on it. But I think, again, it's one of those methods things that's kind of important for people to understand. When you want to do a survey on, say, a welfare scheme or the heat wave, you then randomly draw, say, 10,000 people from that, right? And I think people may not be aware, and so maybe you could just say something about this. This is the way polling around the world is going, right? That you basically pre-select a large enough and diverse enough panel and then sample from within that. Just say a little bit that process.
We started doing was we started taking our satellite data, or we started taking other information and saying, look, I want this much sample here, this much sample there, and this much sample there, which actually changes the way in which you do some of the sampling. But once you're able to say, I know that I have this many data points in this geography and this many data points in this geography, it turns out that's exactly what you need to be able to run a proper statistical model. So this is how polling is done around the world, as you've said. The key piece of information is that I need to know how you answer.
Right.
I need to know 1 or 2 pieces of information about you, your demographics, and I need to know where you are. Once we're able to control sampling or calling phone numbers where people are in a particular way, and so we're able to tie the phone numbers to where people are, that gives you the power to be able to make the kinds of estimates that we.
But just to clarify, I mean, the innovation here, but also the payoff is that if you take census data,
Right.
or you take satellite data, or you take data from the National Family Health Survey, and then you correlate that or join that with your data, that allows you to have a deeper understanding of who these people are, number one, where they're located, number two, but also to ensure that you have socioeconomic and other forms of diversity in the data, right?
Exactly. And the thing is, just as we said, certain questions are more sensitive. Certain questions are maybe have a high cognitive burden. People don't want to answer them. So you will get biases in any survey you run.
Yeah.
It's not just a phone survey. The advantage of being able to do this correlation and being able to look at how subgroups respond to this sort of information is that it allows us to simultaneously understand the biases, but also understand how these very different demographics respond to a particular question.
So let me just kind of wrap this up, Neelan, by just asking you to project into the future and tell us a little. I mean, this is kind of a new venture. You've now kind of gotten your feet wet. You have some use cases. You have publications out there, long form, short form, so on and so forth. Where do you take this going forward?
So, in some sense, the vision is fairly straightforward, which is you want as many use cases as possible. And there's a lot in that statement, right? A use case could be here's something a government wants. A use case could be here's a particularly difficult population to reach. A use case could be here's a particularly difficult problem that requires satellite data, government data, some other kind of data that I have to collect by hand, and a rapid insight, right? So the imagination of where this needs to go is because it's the most important thing for what CRI is doing, is we have to continue working with governments and continue to build use cases with governments and figure out how to make this as useful for policymaking as possible. But the second thing is that we want to be able to use this tool to solve more and more sophisticated problems. Now, that might mean, as I say, combining what we do with other pieces of information that are out there. But as we generate these use cases, we can also demonstrate to a more sophisticated policy community exactly what is possible with rapid insights and sort of the speed of being able to create a data point, right? The speed at which you can learn something about the world, one piece of information that you really want to know. You don't have to wait 6 months. You don't have to wait for the next census. You only have to wait 48 hours.
So let me just conclude this by just asking you, we're sitting in lovely Kerala. We're at the tail end of the monsoon. We've had some heavy rains. Imagine there was a situation of flooding. And how would you then use that kind of natural experiment, right? This act of God to set up a rapid survey? And what is the data you can bring to bear if you were interested in, say, the impact of flooding on somebody's life?
So here are 2 or 3 pieces of information. First, that exists on the government side. We know from satellite data what historical weather patterns have been. We know from satellite data and weather station data what historical weather patterns have been. We know from satellite data what the built environment looks like, how built up the areas are, how green they are, how low-lying they are, so on elevations, right? What we don't know in that case is exactly what people are facing as a result of the flood, right? Typically, in a situation like this, you'll also get some real-time estimation from a satellite shot as to how flooded a place is, right? So I have 3 pieces of information: historical weather patterns, built area, current flood situation. What I don't know is the prevalence of illnesses.
Right.
What I don't know
Homes
is
that were affected, destroyed, damaged in some way.
so now you use the rapid information tool, right? You have very, very good coverage in a place like Kerala, actually, right? You pick based on where the flooding has occurred,
Right.
exactly where you should be calling people. And then you go and you get this piece of information. You get that data point.
And then that becomes an insight that if you were doing this, say, with the government of Kerala,
That's right.
that could feed into their own response process to help deal and alleviate suffering, pain in flood-affected areas, for
Yeah,
instance.
I mean, during a flood, who has the capacity to build a brick-and-mortar survey and send, people here? We can't even find half the people, right? You can reach them on the phone, but they're not where they normally stay, right?
Right. Well, Neelan, congratulations. This is super exciting. I've talked to you about this idea when it was just an idea in somebody's head, so it's nice to see it in practice, and good luck rolling it out.
Thank you. Thank you.